Imagine being trapped in a hospital late at night, alone, with only the hum of flickering lights to keep you company. You step into an empty elevator, expecting a quick descent, but at every floor, the doors open to something darker, something waiting. By the time you reach the basement, you'll wish you never stepped inside. This is the terrifying story of the elevator game. Stay till the end, but don't look behind you, because someone might be watching. Fair warning, some of these tales may haunt you long after you've heard them. Before we begin, I request you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. On that note, let's begin. Ghost of Room 411. Lauren Parker had been working at Crestwood General Hospital for only a few weeks when she was assigned her first night shift. At 27, she was new to nursing, but eager to prove herself. Crestwood wasn't particularly large, but it had a long history, almost 70 years of treating patients. Over the decades, parts of the building had become obsolete, including the East Wing, which had been sealed off years ago due to disrepair. Lauren didn't mind the idea of working nights. She liked the quiet, the slower pace compared to the chaos of the day shift. But as the hours ticked by that evening, she began to notice just how empty the hospital could feel after dark. The usual hum of voices and distant monitors was replaced by an unsettling stillness. Her shift began like any other. She checked on patients, restocked supplies, and filled out paperwork. By 11 p.m., she had settled into a rhythm, her nerves easing. It wasn't until she wheeled a supply cart down the hall near the sealed East Wing that she felt something change. The double doors leading to the old wing loomed at the end of the corridor, their chipped paint and tarnished handles a stark contrast to the polished walls of the active hospital. Lauren slowed as she passed them, feeling an inexplicable chill. Then she heard it, faint footsteps echoing from beyond the doors. She stopped, her hand instinctively tightening on the cart. The sound was soft but deliberate, the unmistakable shuffle of feet on tile. "Hello," she called, her voice breaking the silence. No answer. She took a step closer to the doors, peering through the small, wire-reinforced window. The corridor beyond was dark, the lights long since disconnected. But as she squinted into the shadows, she thought she saw movement. Just a flicker, like someone slipping out of sight. Lauren's rational mind kicked in. It had to be her imagination. The wing had been locked up for years, and no one had any reason to be there. Still, the footsteps lingered in her mind as she continued her rounds. Later that night, as she returned to the same hallway, she smelled something faint and acrid in the air. Smoke. She froze, her eyes darting to the sealed doors. The scent was stronger here, as though the old wing itself had retained the memory of a fire. Her pulse quickened. She knew the hospital's history. There had been a fire in the East Wing decades ago. She debated calling security, but hesitated, not wanting to seem paranoid. Instead, she decided to investigate. Retrieving the maintenance keys from a nearby cabinet, Lauren unlocked the heavy doors. They creaked open, revealing a pitch-black hallway. She shined her flashlight into the void, illuminating peeling wallpaper, rusted gurneys, and abandoned medical equipment. The air inside was heavy, stale, and cold. "Hello," she called again, her voice trembling. The only response was the echo of her own voice. She stepped inside, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The smell of smoke grew stronger, mingled with an unplaceable metallic tang. As she moved deeper into the corridor, her footsteps echoed unnervingly loud. Then she heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they were clearer, closer. Lauren swung her flashlight around, the beam dancing across the empty hallway. "If someone's there, you need to leave. This area is off limits," she said, trying to sound authoritative. The footsteps stopped, and then, from the far end of the corridor, a figure emerged. It was an elderly man in a hospital gown, his back to her. He stood motionless, his posture stiff, his head slightly tilted as if listening. "Sir, are you all right?" Lauren called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't respond. She took a cautious step forward. "Sir, let me help you. You shouldn't be here." Slowly, almost mechanically, the man began to turn. Lauren's breath caught in her throat as the flashlight illuminated his face. His skin was ashen, his eyes hollow and lifeless, sunken into blackened sockets. His lips were cracked and dry, and his neck and hands were charred, the flesh twisted and burned. Her legs felt like lead as he locked eyes with her, his gaze piercing and unrelenting. Then, as abruptly as he appeared, he vanished. The hallway was empty again. Lauren's mind raced. She stumbled backward, her flashlight shaking in her hand. Without another thought, she turned and ran, slamming the heavy doors shut behind her. She leaned against the doors, gasping for breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to believe it was a trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But the vividness of the man's face, the smell of smoke, and the weight of his gaze said otherwise. Unable to keep it to herself, Lauren shared what happened with Mary, a veteran nurse, during their break. Mary's face went pale. "You saw him," she whispered. "What do you mean?" Lauren asked, her voice barely audible. Mary hesitated, her gaze darting around as if afraid of being overheard. "Years ago, there was a fire in that wing. They evacuated most of the patients, but there was one man, an elderly patient in room 411. Somehow, they missed him. By the time they realized, it was too late. The fire spread too fast." Lauren felt a chill run down her spine. "You think that was him?" Mary nodded. "People say he still wanders the halls, looking for help. He doesn't hurt anyone. He just appears, like he's still waiting for someone to save him." From that night on, Lauren avoided the East Wing entirely. She finished her rounds quickly, never lingering near the sealed doors. But the memory of the man stayed with her. His burned hands, his hollow eyes, and the faint scent of smoke that seemed to follow her for weeks. Rumors about the East Wing persisted among the staff. Some claimed to see shadows moving through the windows, while others heard faint footsteps echoing in the dead of night. No one dared enter the wing after dark, and the hospital administration avoided discussing the incident altogether. The East Wing remained locked, its secrets buried under layers of dust and silence. But for those who worked the night shift, one truth lingered. The man in room 411 was still there, waiting, hoping that someone might finally save him from his eternal loneliness. The Whispering Room. Crestwood General Hospital was no stranger to whispers of the supernatural. Over its 70-year history, the building had seen its share of tragedies, but none carried the weight of the legend surrounding room 616. Nurses spoke in hushed tones about the room, sharing eerie tales of inexplicable voices, flickering lights, and a presence that seemed to lurk just out of sight. Most dismissed it as overactive imaginations fueled by exhaustion, but the older staff knew better. There was something deeply wrong with room 616. When Clara Adams began her first shift at Crestwood, she was determined not to let the hospital's ghost stories get to her. Fresh out of nursing school, she prided herself on being logical and grounded. On her first day, she overheard the other nurses warning a newcomer to avoid the room during night shifts. Intrigued, Clara asked about the story, but the answers she received were cryptic. "Just stay away from it," an older nurse, Evelyn, advised. "People say the room is cursed." "Cursed how?" Clara asked, her curiosity piqued. Evelyn hesitated, glancing around as if reluctant to be overheard. "A man died there years ago. They say his spirit never left. People hear whispers, like voices calling to them. Some patients get so scared they demand to be moved, and those who stay too long, well, they don't stay the same." Clara laughed nervously, brushing off the story. She wasn't about to let an old wives' tale spook her. But when her first night shift came and she was assigned to a patient in room 616, she felt a twinge of unease. The patient, Mr. Harper, was a middle-aged man recovering from a cardiac episode. When Clara entered the room to check his vitals, she noticed how cold it was. The temperature gauge on the wall read 72 degrees Fahrenheit, but it felt at least 10 degrees colder. She thought about adjusting the thermostat but decided against it, focusing instead on Mr. Harper. "Are you feeling all right?" Clara asked, her voice steady despite the creeping chill in the air. Mr. Harper nodded but seemed distracted. His eyes darted nervously around the room, lingering on the corners. "This room," he murmured, "it feels strange, like someone's watching me." "It's probably just nerves," Clara reassured him. "Try to get some rest." He nodded again, closing his eyes, but his face remained tense. Clara left the room, dismissing his unease as post-cardiac anxiety. But as the night wore on, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Around 3 a.m., as she was completing paperwork at the nurse's station, a loud crash echoed from down the hall. Startled, Clara rushed toward the noise, her heart racing. She found Mr. Harper sitting upright in bed, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "What happened?" Clara asked, glancing around the room. Mr. Harper pointed to the overturned metal tray on the floor. "I heard whispering," he said, his voice trembling. "It woke me up. I thought someone was here, but no one's there." Clara scanned the room, her rational mind searching for an explanation. "It's probably just the vents or the pipes," she said, trying to sound confident. But as she left the room, she couldn't ignore the prickling sensation on the back of her neck, as though unseen eyes were following her. The next night, Clara was assigned to a new patient in room 616, Mrs. Langley, an elderly woman recovering from surgery. At first, Mrs. Langley seemed cheerful, even chatty, but as the evening progressed, her mood shifted. By midnight, she was visibly distressed. "They're talking again," Mrs. Langley whispered, gripping Clara's hand with surprising strength. "Who's talking?" Clara asked, her stomach tightening. "The voices," Mrs. Langley said, her eyes wide with fear. "They're so faint, like whispers. But they're there. I can hear them." Clara tried to reassure her, chalking the whispers up to medication side effects. But deep down, she felt a growing unease. After settling Mrs. Langley for the night, Clara decided to stay in the room for a while, hoping to prove to herself that there was nothing to fear. The hours passed uneventfully, and Clara began to relax. But as the clock struck 3 a.m., the atmosphere in the room changed. The air grew heavy, almost oppressive, and an unnatural stillness settled over everything. Then she heard it, a faint murmur, like distant voices whispering just out of reach. Clara froze, straining to make out the words. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing softly but insistently. She looked at Mrs. Langley, who was sitting upright in bed, her face pale and terrified. "Do you hear them?" Mrs. Langley whispered, her voice trembling. Clara nodded, unable to speak. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic chorus. The lights in the room flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. Clara's heart raced as she scanned the room, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Then she saw it, a shadow darker than the dim light should allow, stretching across the far corner of the room. It moved, twisting and shifting as though alive. Clara grabbed Mrs. Langley's arm, pulling her out of bed. "We're leaving," she said, her voice firm despite her rising panic. Together, they stumbled into the hallway, slamming the door behind them. The next day, Clara couldn't keep the experience to herself. She confided in Evelyn, who listened intently, her expression grim. "You're not the first to see it," Evelyn said. "That room is tied to something. Years ago, a man was admitted there, a schizophrenic patient who claimed he could hear voices telling him to hurt himself. One night he gave in to them. Ever since, strange things have happened in that room. Clara shivered. Why don't they just close it off? They've tried, Evelyn said, but every time, something happens. Like the room refuses to be forgotten. Clara never entered room 616 again, but the whispers haunted her. Late at night, as she walked the halls of Crestwood, she sometimes felt the chill of the room creeping through the air, as though it were calling to her. And no matter how many locks or warnings were placed on its door, room 616 remained a silent, malevolent presence, waiting for its next victim. The elevator game. Dr. Emily Carter prided herself on her resilience. A seasoned physician at St. Mary's Hospital, she was no stranger to long, lonely shifts in the sprawling, labyrinthine building. But something about this particular stormy evening felt off. It was just past midnight, and most of the hospital staff had already gone home. A severe thunderstorm raged outside, rattling the windows with bursts of wind and rain. Inside, the usual hum of activity had quieted to an unsettling stillness. The occasional flicker of the lights, strained by the storm, only added to the eerie atmosphere. Emily stood at the nurse's station, double-checking patient records before calling it a night. Just as she prepared to leave, she remembered the file in her hand, a last-minute addition to her shift. It needed to be delivered to the hospital morgue, located in the basement. She hesitated, glancing down the dimly lit hallway. The basement wasn't a place she liked to visit, even during the day, but her professional obligation outweighed her unease. With a resigned sigh, she walked toward the elevators. The corridor seemed unusually quiet, her footsteps echoing louder than they should. When she reached the elevator bank, only one elevator was operational, its call button glowing faintly. The others were out of service, their doors shut tight like sealed tombs. Emily pressed the button. The elevator arrived almost immediately, its doors sliding open with a slow, metallic groan. She stepped inside and noticed the interior seemed older than she remembered. The walls were tarnished, the mirrors scratched and clouded, and the overhead light flickered weakly. As the doors closed, she pressed the button for the basement. The elevator lurched into motion, its mechanisms groaning as if protesting the descent. The journey started uneventfully, but as the elevator passed the 4th floor, it jolted to a stop. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a dark, empty hallway. Or at least, it seemed empty at first. As her eyes adjusted, Emily spotted something, or someone, standing at the far end of the corridor. It was a figure, motionless, partially obscured by shadow. "Hello," Emily called out, her voice wavering slightly. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It simply stood there, an indistinct silhouette against the darkness. Her unease deepened. She pressed the closed door button, and after what felt like an eternity, the doors finally slid shut. The elevator resumed its descent. When it stopped again, this time at the 3rd floor, Emily's heart sank. The doors opened, and the same figure was there. Only now it was closer. She could see its outline more clearly. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its limbs seemed slightly too long, as if its proportions were all wrong. Panic bubbled up inside her. She frantically pressed the button for the basement, but the elevator refused to move. The door stayed open, as though inviting the figure inside. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself, but her voice was shaking. Finally, the doors closed, and the elevator continued downward. Emily clutched the file to her chest, her hands trembling. When the elevator stopped at the 2nd floor, she felt her stomach drop. The figure was there again, now standing right outside the doors. This time she could make out its face, or what should have been a face. Its head was featureless and smooth, except for 2 hollow indentations where its eyes should have been. Its mouth was a jagged, unnatural grin, stretching too wide across its pale, distorted face. Emily froze, paralyzed with fear. The figure didn't move, but she could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting, boring into her. The elevator doors began to close, but just before they shut completely, the figure tilted its head, as if curious. The motion sent a chill down her spine. When the elevator finally reached the basement, Emily hesitated. The doors slid open, revealing the morgue's dimly lit hallway. Her instinct screamed at her to stay inside, to press the button and go back up, but the file needed to be delivered. Steeling herself, she stepped out, her breath shallow and quick. The hallway was silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. She walked briskly toward the morgue, her shoes clicking against the cold, tiled floor. Every few steps, she glanced over her shoulder, convinced she wasn't alone. As she reached the morgue door, the lights flickered violently. The hallway plunged into darkness, and she heard it, the soft, deliberate sound of footsteps behind her. Emily turned slowly, her heart pounding. The figure was there, standing at the end of the hallway. But this time, it was moving. Its long, spindly limbs carried it forward in slow, deliberate strides. Dropping the file, she sprinted back toward the elevator, her pulse thundering in her ears. She slammed the call button repeatedly, praying the doors would open. The footsteps behind her quickened, growing louder and closer. The elevator arrived just in time. Emily threw herself inside, jamming the button for the first floor. The doors began to close, but before they could shut completely, a pale hand shot through the gap, clawing at the air. With a final jolt, the doors slammed shut, severing the hand mid-reach. Emily collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath as the elevator ascended. When it reached the first floor, the doors opened to reveal an empty hallway. The hand was gone, and the elevator was spotless, as if nothing had happened. Shaken but desperate to leave, Emily ran toward the exit. She never spoke of what happened that night, but she never returned to the hospital after her shift. Months later, the hospital staff began reporting strange occurrences. The elevator would stop at random floors late at night, and some claimed to see a shadowy figure waiting in the halls. Legend has it, if you ride that elevator alone after midnight, the figure might still be waiting for someone to join it in the basement. Hands of horror. Dr. Thomas Grayson was renowned in his field, an esteemed surgeon with decades of experience. He was the kind of doctor that everyone trusted. His skill in the operating room was unmatched, and he had saved countless lives. But there was a dark side to Dr. Grayson that very few knew about, one that haunted the very halls of Blackwood Medical Center. The hospital was old, with a history stretching back to the 1800s. It had seen its fair share of strange events over the years, but none as disturbing as the tales surrounding Dr. Grayson. It was said that the surgeon had a gift that allowed him to perform surgeries with flawless precision, saving even the most hopeless cases. But the source of his ability was not just his skill. It was something far more sinister. Some whispered that Dr. Grayson had made a pact with a dark force, a curse that allowed him to save lives, but at a terrible price. The curse began when Dr. Grayson was a young resident at Blackwood Medical Center. He had been a rising star in the medical field, with a brilliant mind and an insatiable drive to succeed. But there was one patient, a young woman named Eliza, who would change his life forever. Eliza had been admitted after a horrific car accident. Her injuries were so severe that her chances of survival were slim. The doctors said it was hopeless. She would not make it. But Dr. Grayson couldn't accept defeat. He was determined to save her, to prove that his skill could overcome even the most impossible of circumstances. For hours, he worked tirelessly, performing surgery after surgery. But despite his best efforts, Eliza's condition only worsened. Her blood pressure dropped, her organs began to fail, and soon, Dr. Grayson was faced with the grim reality that he was losing her. In desperation, Dr. Grayson made a fateful decision. He turned to the dark arts. He had heard rumors of an ancient ritual that could save lives, no matter how dire the situation. It was said that the ritual required a sacrifice, a life to be given in exchange for another. But Dr. Grayson, driven by his need to succeed and his obsession with saving Eliza, ignored the warnings. He performed the ritual in the secrecy of the hospital's basement, under the cover of darkness. As he chanted the incantation, a cold wind filled the room, and the air grew thick with an unnatural energy. He could feel the presence of something dark and powerful, something that was waiting for him to complete the ritual. In that moment, Dr. Grayson made a pact that would bind him to the curse forever. The next morning, Eliza's condition had miraculously improved. Her vital signs stabilized, and within hours, she was awake and coherent. Dr. Grayson was hailed as a hero. He had saved her life when everyone else had given up, but he knew the truth. He had made a deal with something far darker than any of them could understand. Years passed, and Dr. Grayson's career flourished. He became the head surgeon at Blackwood Medical Center, performing delicate surgeries and saving countless lives. But the price of his pact was becoming more evident with each passing year. Dr. Grayson began to notice strange things happening around him. Patients who survived his surgeries began to experience disturbing nightmares, as though they were being watched. Some reported hearing whispers in the dark of the night, voices that seemed to call to them from the shadows. Others began to suffer from inexplicable pain in the areas where Dr. Grayson had operated on them. But it didn't stop there. As the years went on, Dr. Grayson began to age unnaturally quickly. His once youthful appearance began to wither, his skin pale and wrinkled, his hair graying prematurely. He had sacrificed his own humanity for the gift of saving others, and now the curse was beginning to take its toll. The worst part, however, was the visions. Dr. Grayson would wake up in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. He would see Eliza, only she was no longer the vibrant young woman he had saved. Instead, she was a hollow, lifeless shell, her eyes empty and cold. She would stare at him, accusing him of the deal he had made, of the soul he had sacrificed for her life. But no matter how much he tried to shake the visions, they only grew stronger. Eventually, the whispers grew louder, and he began to hear them during the day as well. His patients would complain about hearing strange voices during their surgeries, and some even claimed that they saw shadowy figures lurking in the corners of the operating room. As the years dragged on, Dr. Grayson's sanity began to unravel. He became paranoid, refusing to perform surgeries unless he was alone. He stopped sleeping, fearing that the darkness would come for him. He had realized too late that the price of his pact was not just his own soul. It was the souls of all the patients he had saved. And then one fateful night, it happened. Dr. Grayson was performing an emergency surgery on a young boy who had been in a terrible accident. The boy was barely conscious, his life hanging in the balance. As Dr. Grayson worked, he felt a coldness in the room, a presence that he could not escape. The whispers were deafening now, and as he looked up, he saw her, Eliza, standing in the doorway of the operating room, her empty eyes staring at him. "Help me," she whispered, her voice like a rasping breath. "You can never escape what you've done." The room seemed to close in on him, and for the first time, Dr. Grayson realized the full weight of his actions. The curse had come to collect its due, and there was no escape. The boy on the operating table flatlined, his life slipping away as Dr. Grayson looked on in horror. He reached out, desperately trying to save him, but it was too late. The darkness had already claimed him. The next morning, when the hospital staff arrived, they found Dr. Grayson in the operating room, his eyes wide open but lifeless. He had died, his body cold and withered, as though the years had caught up with him all at once. And in his hand, clenched tightly, was a small piece of paper, a note that read, "I'm sorry, I couldn't save myself." To this day, Dr. Grayson's name is whispered among the staff at Blackwood Medical Center. His legacy as a brilliant surgeon is overshadowed by the dark pact that led to his downfall. Some say that the curse still lingers in the hospital, that the souls of his patients are trapped within the walls, waiting for their turn to collect the price that was promised. And as the years go by, some claim to hear the faint sound of whispers in the dark halls of Blackwood, whispers that carry the curse of the surgeon who tried to cheat death. Trapped in time, Dr. Matthew Harmon had been practicing medicine for nearly 30 years, but he had never encountered a case like Peter Reynolds. Peter was admitted to St. Elmo's Hospital after a severe car accident. His body shattered, multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and head trauma. Yet, despite the severity of his injuries, there was something strange about his condition. Peter didn't just survive. He healed in ways that baffled the doctors. It was as though he defied the laws of medicine. When Peter first woke up after being in a coma for 3 weeks, his condition seemed to improve at an impossible rate. His fractures began to mend, his internal bleeding subsided, and his health stabilized faster than any trauma patient Dr. Harmon had seen. But as the days passed, it became clear that something wasn't right. Peter didn't need food, didn't sleep, and never showed signs of physical fatigue. His mind, though, was another mystery. When he regained consciousness, he muttered something unsettling. "I'm not supposed to be here." Dr. Harmon, intrigued by the case, decided to take Peter on as his patient. He noticed more oddities. Despite all medical efforts, Peter's body appeared suspended in time. His injuries healed at an impossible rate, and he looked almost untouched by trauma. It was as if Peter's body was locked in a perpetual state of youth and vitality, never growing older or showing signs of wear. Driven by curiosity, Dr. Harmon ran endless tests, but they came back normal, too normal. Peter's blood was perfect. His heart functioned better than most athletes, but his mind remained distant, flat, and emotionless. Peter spoke little and always gave cryptic answers when spoken to. His condition seemed to go beyond physical healing. Weeks later, Dr. Harmon stayed late at the hospital, reviewing Peter's records. He stumbled across a note from a previous doctor who had treated Peter after a car accident years ago. The doctor mentioned that Peter had been fully healed and discharged, only to return later for another similar accident. The doctor had noted Peter's case as unique, but didn't think much of it at the time. Confused, Dr. Harmon dug further into the archives and found something chilling. The name Peter Reynolds appeared in the hospital's records over the years. Each time Peter had been admitted for different accidents or injuries, but the details were eerily similar. His fractures healed at an abnormal rate. It was as though Peter had been through these cycles before. That's when Dr. Harmon made a horrifying realization. Peter wasn't just a freak of nature. He was stuck in a cycle, repeatedly injured, healed, and reborn. Each time he woke up in the hospital, he forgot what had happened before. His memories wiped clean, as if each life was a new beginning. No matter how many times he healed, he never aged. He was always the same, always trapped in this loop. Dr. Harmon was horrified. Peter was a prisoner, caught in an endless cycle of trauma and recovery, unable to escape. Every injury was just the catalyst for his rebirth. Peter's condition was supernatural, beyond the realm of medicine. When Dr. Harmon confronted Peter about his discovery, Peter's response was chilling. "I don't remember when it started," Peter said softly, "but I've been here many times. I wake up thinking that maybe this time it will be different, but it never is. I keep coming back." Dr. Harmon's mind raced. Was Peter cursed? Was this an ancient punishment, or something else? Each injury led to his healing, and each healing led to another beginning, another cycle. Peter was trapped, and so was the hospital. As Dr. Harmon dug deeper into the records, He found names like Paul Riley and Michael Green, aliases Peter had used in past admissions. Each patient had identical injuries, identical healing, and identical lifespans. It was as though the same man had lived multiple lives, always returning after death, only to live again. Dr. Harmon realized that there was no escape. Peter Reynolds wasn't a man. He was an eternal prisoner of time, doomed to repeat this cycle forever. No matter how many times Peter died, he would return, always young, always healing. One night, Dr. Harmon confronted Peter one last time. He told him everything he had uncovered, the curse, the endless cycle of rebirth. But Peter simply shook his head. "I've tried," he whispered. "I've tried to escape, but it's no use. This is my fate." The next morning, Dr. Harmon was found in his office, dead from a heart attack. His face was frozen in terror, and his hands clutched a note that simply read, "I warned you. Now you understand." Peter Reynolds remains at St. Elmo's Hospital, his body unchanged, his mind blank. He continues to heal, to be reborn, and to live out his endless life. For Peter, the hospital is his prison, and no one can break his curse. Those who work at St. Elmo's avoid Peter's room. They know the truth. Some patients are better left alone. And Peter Reynolds isn't just a patient. He is the forever patient, trapped in an endless cycle that no one can break. Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe for more scary stories.